Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that sounds maybe deceptively simple: replay attacks. Think of it like taking a perfectly valid digital signal or piece of data, something meant for just one moment or one place, and just, well, using it again where it wasn't supposed to go.
Exactly. And while that idea sounds basic, our sources really show how potent and, widespread it can actually be. It's not just theory. It can impact, well, everything from parts of your daily routine to the really complex layers of blockchain and crypto.
Yeah, we've got quite a stack of sources here, articles, some research, real-world examples that dig into exactly how this works and where it's actually shown up.
It's a dive into how just repeating something can become a pretty powerful exploit.
Absolutely. So our mission for this deep dive, and we're drawing only from the information in these sources, is to get a clear handle on what a replay attack actually is. We want to see where it's popped up, in the real world, and especially in blockchain, understand how realistic that risk is, and maybe most importantly, figure out what you need to know about, well, protecting yourself or just understanding the landscape going forward. Let's try and figure this out together.
Sounds like a good plan.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. How do our sources define a replay attack in plain English?
Well, basically, it's an attack where someone, an adversary, intercepts some legitimate data being sent,
Yeah.
and then they just retransmit it. The whole point is to trick a system into thinking that replay data is a fresh, valid signal happening right now.
Okay.
The sources sometimes describe it as like a passive attack, maybe a simpler relative of a man-in-the-middle attack. The key thing is taking a message that was valid and just reusing it in a context where it really shouldn't be valid anymore.
So it's not about cracking encryption or faking data. It's really just about hitting repeat on something genuine you managed to grab.
Precisely. You captured something real, something valid, and now you're just playing it back to get some kind of unauthorized result.
Right. And the classic example from the sources really kind of nails this, doesn't it? Alice wants to log into Bob's system, sends her hashed password. Eve's listening, grabs that hash. Later, Eve doesn't need Alice's actual password at all.
Nope.
She just replays that exact same hash to Bob's system. Bob gets it, thinks, oh, that's Alice, and lets her in.
Yes, that's the absolute core concept right there, reusing a captured legitimate credential or message.
And our sources make it really clear this isn't just a crypto thing, right?
Yeah.
Where else does this basic vulnerability show up?
Oh, it's kind of everywhere digital signals get used.
Yeah.
The sources give some really fascinating examples well beyond just computers and networks.
Like what?
Well, remote keyless car entry. Modern systems are tougher, sure, but older ones, or even some newer ones with fancy methods like buffered replay, they can be vulnerable. An attacker grabs the signal from your key fob when you lock or unlock and can just replay it later to open your car. They might even jam the original signal, capture it, and then use it after you've walked away.
Wow. Okay.
Then there's IoT devices, smart home stuff, increasingly targeted. Imagine intercepting the signal from your phone app, turning on a smart plug, or maybe unlocking a door lock. The sources mention a study found something like 75% of the tested smart devices with local connections were vulnerable to this. An attacker could just replay the unlock signal they grabbed earlier.
75%, that's huge.
Yeah. And even things like voice verification systems. Just recording your voice saying a command or verifying your identity and then playing that recording back to the system. Sources mention countermeasures like spectral analysis to try and spot recordings, but the vulnerability exists. And my favorite example from the sources, just because it's so simple, the folktale of Alibaba. He overhears, "Open, Sesame," right? And then he just replays it himself to get into the cave.
Yeah.
It's basically the same principle.
The original low-tech replay attack, that really drives home how fundamental this is. Okay, so it's everywhere. But it feels like we hear about it most often with blockchain. Why is blockchain, with its reputation for security, for immutability, why is it particularly susceptible sometimes?
That's where it gets interesting. Blockchain's strength is that decentralized, immutable ledger, no doubt. But the way transactions are built, how they're signed with private keys and then broadcast, that can create specific replay risks, especially during certain events like protocol changes.
Okay.
The core concern in blockchain replay, as the sources highlight, is taking a perfectly valid transaction meant for one chain or one context and having it successfully processed on another, often unintended chain or context.
And this often comes up with something called a hard fork, right? What exactly is a hard fork and how does it set the stage for this kind of attack?
Right, so a hard fork is a major change to a blockchain's rules. It's non-backward compatible. That means nodes the computer's running the software, that stick with the old rules, won't recognize or process blocks created under the new rules. And sometimes this actually splits the blockchain into two distinct chains moving forward.
Okay, so you basically end up with two parallel versions of history or the ledger from that point on.
Exactly. And the vulnerability pops up because, at least for a while, the way transactions are formatted and the cryptographic signatures used on the original chain,
Yeah.
they might still be seen as perfectly valid on the new chain, too.
So hang on. If I had coins on the original chain, then after the split, I have identical coins on both the old and the new chain.
Yeah.
And I use my private key to make a transaction on one.
That's precisely the problem. The sources use the Bitcoin Cash hard fork as a really clear example. Imagine Alice had Bitcoin before a fork. Afterwards, she has equivalent amounts on both, say, the new Bitcoin Cash chain, BCH-ABC, and maybe a competing chain that also split off, BCH-SV.
Got it.
Now, if she signs a transaction to send, let's say, 5 BCH-ABC to Bob using her private key, that exact same transaction, the same data, the same signature, might also be valid for the 5 BCH-SV she holds on the other chain.
Why? Because her private key proves ownership of those coins, or rather those outputs, on both ledgers.
Yes, exactly. A node running the BCH-EHV software could see Alice's transaction broadcast for the BCH-ABC chain. It performs the same cryptographic checks, confirms her signature is valid for the equivalent coins she holds on its chain, the SV chain, and just processes it.
So her single action, which she only intended for the BCH-ABC chain,
Right.
it accidentally gets processed on the BCH-SV chain too. She basically sent coins twice from her perspective, just on different ledgers.
That is the classic hard fork replay attack scenario. A valid transaction from one chain gets replayed, picked up, and validated on the other because the format and the signature are identical and valid on both.
Yeah.
It leads to unintended double spending across the chains.
Wow, okay, that sounds like a really significant problem if you're not careful. What about replay attacks involving smart contracts? The sources mention that too. How does that work?
Yeah, smart contracts add another layer, another dimension to this. Instead of just replaying a simple transfer of value, attackers can try to replay actions related to the logic inside the contract itself. The sources point to vulnerabilities often connected to something called off-chain signing.
Off-chain signing, what's that?
That's where you, as a user, sign a message or an approval off the actual blockchain, maybe in your wallet app or on a website. And that signed message is later submitted to the blockchain to trigger an action within a smart contract, like authorizing a withdrawal from a multi-sig wallet or approving a token swap.
Okay, so it's not the final transaction itself, but like a signed permission slip for the contract.
Exactly. A signed instruction. And attackers can find ways to reuse these signed instructions maliciously. For instance, taking a message you signed to approve action A on a contract, and then somehow reusing that same signed message later to trigger action B on the same contract, something you never intended. Or, in more complex cases mentioned, maybe reusing old signed messages on a contract that was deployed at the same address again after being destroyed. There are tricky ways involving specific blockchain features like Create2.
So it sounds like attackers are trying to get you to sign something that looks legit,
Often, yes.
but then they take that signature, that authorization, and use it for something else entirely within the smart contracts rules.
That's a good way to put it. It's about reusing your valid consent, your signature, in a different context or at a different time than you meant it for. The sources bring up sophisticated attacks, like the Bybit exchange incident. It wasn't a simple cross-chain replay, but it involved attackers tricking users into signing transactions that looked like normal transfers, but actually contained hidden malicious instructions. By exploiting how signatures worked in their multi-sig setup and using features like delegate call, they essentially replayed the user's authorization for one thing, to achieve a completely different harmful outcome, like replacing the core logic of the contract itself.
Okay, that's pretty complex. Which leads us to a really crucial question. Are these attacks just, theoretical worries that academics talk about, or have they actually happened? And building on that, how realistic is the risk for people today? Should we, really be worried about this?
Oh, they are absolutely not just theoretical. They have definitely occurred. The Bitcoin Cash hard fork situation we discussed, that was a very real concern. And implementing replay protection was a critical issue they had to deal with.
Right.
The potential smart contract vulnerabilities highlighted in the sources and incidents like that Bybit one involving manipulated signing, they show that sophisticated attackers are actively looking for and sometimes exploiting these kinds of weaknesses. There's a Reddit source we looked at, for instance, that talks plainly about the real problems people faced during the BCH-BSV split, because replay protection wasn't universally applied. It even mentions a case of a corrupted wallet client trying to move coins across different forks unintentionally because of this stuff.
So the risk is definitely real then, particularly around those contentious hard forks. Or maybe if you're interacting with complex smart contracts or systems using that off-chain signing without really solid safeguards.
Correct. For an average user, probably the most likely direct impact would be during a hard fork if their wallet or the exchange they use doesn't handle replay protection correctly or automatically. That could lead to those unintended coin movements on a different chain we talked about. For developers or people managing significant assets or heavily involved in complex DeFi protocols, those smart contract vectors are, well, a more intricate but definitely real concerns. So, yeah, awareness is necessary.
Okay, so awareness is key. But should we be panicked? Or are there things we can actually do to protect ourselves?
Yeah, the sources really emphasize that while the threat is real, especially in those specific situations, there are concrete mitigation strategies, things users and developers can do. You don't just have to sit there and hope it doesn't happen. You can take steps.
Okay, good. What are some of those steps?
Well, for hard forks, the best approach is really implementing replay protection right into the protocol itself. This means making sure transactions on one chain are definitely invalid on the other, stopping that cross-chain replay cold. This could involve adding unique data to transactions on the new chain, or maybe using different signature methods. Sometimes you hear about opt-in replay protection, where users have to manually do something to make their transactions specific to one chain.
Okay, so technical fixes mainly.
At the protocol level, yes. But beyond the code, community and exchange coordination is also vital. Clear communication, maybe exchanges pausing trading during the critical fork period, helping users understand what, if anything, they need to do, and, trying to foster community unity to avoid those really nasty, contentious splits in the first place helps too.
Makes sense. And what about for the smart contract side of things, those more technical replay types?
That's primarily on the developers building these things. Things like rigorous code audits, using well-tested, safe programming libraries, and even formal verification methods. These are all crucial to try and catch logic flaws that an attacker could exploit for replay or reusing authorization. And of course, keeping code updated as new issues are found.
And are there more general sort of user-level security practices that help protect against these kinds of attacks or maybe related threats that leverage similar weaknesses?
Absolutely. A lot of the standard crypto security advice you hear, which the sources also recommend, acts as layers of defense here too. Multi-signature wallets, multi-sig. Requiring more than one person or more than one key to sign off on a transaction makes it much harder for an attacker who maybe only captured one signature or compromised one key to replay an action. Cold storage hardware wallets. Keeping your private keys completely offline. Since replay attacks often involve using captured data or signals online, having your keys offline makes them immune to that kind of online capture or replay attempt.
Right, that's a big one.
Definitely. Also, two-factor or multi-factor authentication, two-FAMPA. Adding extra security layers to your accounts on exchanges or other services. Monitoring your wallet activity, just keeping an eye on your transaction history. Maybe setting up alerts. Spotting an unexpected transaction quickly could be the first sign something's wrong, maybe a replay or similar attack. Using reputable platforms, starting with well-known exchanges and wallets that have strong security reputations, and ideally moving significant assets off those exchanges into your own secure wallet fairly quickly. Secure backups, making sure you have safe offline backups of your recovery phrases or private keys. Secure backups. And then there are technical things developers can do in protocols, like using timestamping or unique session IDs to ensure a message isn't just valid, but also current, not just some old message you replayed.
Okay, so the sources really paint a picture where replay attacks are, a real demonstrated vulnerability. They seem particularly triggered by events like blockchain hard forks, or maybe when you're interacting with complex smart contracts, especially those using off-chain signing or certain functions that can be tricky. And it's not just crypto. It shows up in everyday tech like car keys, smart homes. But crucially, there are multiple layers of defense. There are technical fixes for chains and contracts, and also just robust security practices that users themselves can adopt.
That sums up the key takeaways from the sources very well, I think.
Fantastic. So you're now much better informed about replay attacks. You understand they are a real threat. Definitely not just theoretical. They happen in the past, especially around hard forks, but also in other digital systems you probably interact with. And importantly, there are concrete steps people are taking and that you can take to mitigate the risk involved.
Yeah, understanding how attackers can basically weaponize something as simple as repetition. It's pretty key to staying safer in this digital world.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into replay attacks. And as you think about how easily digital information can be captured and repeated, it really does make you wonder, doesn't it? In a world built on copying and transmitting data constantly, how much does our security really depend not just on, complex encryption or unbreakable math, but on that really subtle challenge of simply ensuring that a message isn't just valid in itself, but it's also the right message for this exact moment in time?